So how did this idea evolve? In 1978, the 9/11 concept was started to be pushed by Israelis. And the guy that pushed it the most was this man, Arnon Milchan, or Milchan, some people say. He's a Hollywood producer today, but his very first movie was made in England and France. It's called The Medusa Touch. It starred Richard Burton. And the climactic scene in the movie is the 747 crashing into the Pan Am building. And the same year he made this movie, in 1978, here you see he's very buddy-buddy with Israel's defense minister, Ezer Weizmann. Here they are preparing the props for that scene that they made when they made the movie. This is what I call Israeli ideation. What they're doing with this movie is they're putting out there into the public mind the idea that airplanes can be flying into high-rise buildings. And then in the year 2000, he made another film like this, in which it was the World Trade Center was the target. And it was a passenger aircraft flying into the World Trade Center. This was a program, this was the pilot episode of a series called The Lone Gunman, which was a spin-off of The X-Files. And it was made by Rupert Murdoch and his partner, Arnon Milchan. And it was filmed in New York City, actually. They filmed this scene using helicopters flying at the World Trade Center. And then they, of course, used computer-generated imagery to put the plane in there. And it aired on TV, on Fox TV, in March 2001, and was seen by millions of people in the United States. Here it is, Arnon Milchan, the man in the middle, between his two buddies, Shimon Peres on one side and Bibi Netanyahu on the other. And it's reported that Milchan is one of the richest media moguls, or moguls in Hollywood. They say he's the number 2, I think. And they say he's worth $5.2 billion. But he has a long history of being a money launderer. If you read his biography, he's been laundering money for the South Africans and the Israelis for a long time. So the question is, really, whose money is it? Whose money is he using? Well, here's the Netanyahus, father and son. In 1976 to 78, Bibi Netanyahu worked for the Boston Consulting Group, which is a Rothschild-owned company in Boston. And in 1979, he went from the Rothschild firm back to Israel and started the Netanyahu Institute on Terrorism. And they had a conference in July of that year in which they began the big propaganda push, the media push, the political push for the war on terror in 1979. Most of you were kids then, I know. And here in 1980, we have the Isser Harel, the former head of the Mossad. He's the first chief of the Mossad, first chief of Shin Bet. He's a long-term Israeli intelligence expert. And he made a prediction to an American Zionist in 1980 that Arabs would attack the tallest building in New York. Here's what he said. The American Michael Evans asked him, "Do you think terrorism will come to America? And if so, where and why?" And he said, "I fear it will come to you in America. America has the power but not the will to fight terrorism." La la la. And then as to the where, Isser Harel continued, "New York City is the symbol of freedom and capitalism. It's likely they will strike the Empire State Building, your tallest building, and a symbol of your power." How amazing. What amazing prescience that this head of the Mossad knows that 21 years ahead of time, 21 years before, that Arabs would be attacking the World Trade Center. Now, that was his prediction, but oddly, he began putting that prediction into reality. He sent two of his head men, two of his chief men, these two guys, to New York in 1980, and they were given the task of getting the security contract for the World Trade Center. And they had a little company, not theirs, it was Shaul Eisenberg's company. It's called Atwell Security of Tel Aviv, and it was created especially for this purpose, to get the security contract for the World Trade Center. Now, they actually got it. In 1987, they had the contract, but somebody at the Port Authority discovered that the man that was the president of the company, the man with suspenders, is Shalom Ben Dor here, that this man was convicted of murder in Israel. As a former head of Shin Bet, he had been involved in arresting some Palestinians for hijacking a bus. And when they got all the passengers off the bus, they had these Palestinian guys there that had been behind the attack. And his men in the field said, "Well, we got these guys, what do we do with them now?" And he said, "Smash their heads with rocks." And so that's what they did, and it led to a legal case in Israel, and he was removed from his position and charged with their murder. And when the Americans discovered that history, they said, "We can't have this guy running security at the World Trade Center. That doesn't go." So they tore up the contract. But had that contract not been torn up, 9/11 would have happened probably in the late 1980s or early 1990s at the latest. But they were stymied, they were stifled, they were prevented. So what did they do? They went to work for these guys. They went to work for Jules Kroll and Maurice Greenberg. If you remember, Maurice Greenberg is the man who owned AIG, the insurance company that we bailed out for $183 billion in 2008. Well, these two guys are partners in crime, partners in business. And Jules Kroll, his company, he had a company called Kroll Associates. And Kroll Associates got the security contract for the World Trade Center in 1993. And when Kroll Associates got the contract for the World Trade Center, these men were already working for him. Avraham Shalom Ben-Dor was working for the man on the top here. And so what they did is when the Israelis were thwarted from getting the security contract, they used like a Trojan horse mechanism and went through an American scion, an American helper, who then got them the contract, got them into the business. This is 1982. This is when the Israelis invaded Lebanon a second time. And here's Ariel Sharon, the man who led the occupation, led the attack, which was a terribly murderous campaign, if you remember 1982. It was really the last time that we had some decent news television in this country. That was when Ted Turner still owned CNN, and Ted Turner's CNN showed what was happening in this war, in real time. And you probably all remember that in 1983, the truck bombs attacked the U.S. Embassy in Beirut and the Marine barracks at the airport. And in the attack on the Marine barracks, 241 U.S. Marines were killed. And they were killed by a truck bomb that the Israelis, the Mossad, knew all about. The Mossad knew the type of the truck, where it was being built, what kind of bomb it had, the license plates, everything. But they didn't tell that to the American military. So the American military paid the price in blood. The head of Israeli intelligence said to the other Mossad people, he said, the Americans are a big country. They can take care of themselves. So what it indicates, though, is that the Mossad knew all about the truck bomb. Now, how did the Mossad know all about the truck bomb if they weren't involved in making the truck bomb? And those details can be gleaned from the book by the former Mossad operative agent. His name is Victor Ostrovsky. He's a Canadian. He was a Mossad agent. And he, after his term over there with the Mossad and everything, he came back to Canada and the United States. And I think he lives in Arizona now. And he wrote some books called By Way of Deception and Beyond Deception. This information is all coming from him. This is how the idea of catastrophic terrorism was pushed on the American intelligentsia. Through a magazine like this, is Council of Foreign Relations magazine called Foreign Affairs. And in 1998, Philip Zelikow, the man who wrote the 9/11 Commission report, headed a study group called the Catastrophic Terrorism Study Group with Ashton Carter and John Deutsch. Ashton Carter is, of course, today our Secretary of Defense. And in this document that they had published, this is a report of their findings of their study group, they imagined the transforming event. And they talk about that transforming act of catastrophic terrorism that will change America. And I think most of you will agree that America has been gravely changed, profoundly altered by the events of 9/11. And the men that wrote that catastrophic terrorism report, as I said, were Ashton Carter and John Deutsch with Philip Zelikow. Ashton Carter's top left, man in the middle with the blue sweaters, Ashton Carter, former head of the CIA. Now, the important thing about Ashton Carter to understand, if you look at his resume, you will see that his entire life has been spent as an employee of the Rothschild family, which is to say that our defense minister today is basically a Rothschild agent. Now, another group that had a big role in transforming American military policy was this group called Project for the New American Century. And the PNAC people are these people at the bottom here. The Kagan family, Donald Kagan, a Lithuanian-born Jewish fella, Robert Kagan and Fred, and Robert's wife is Victoria Nuland. If any of you recall what happened in Ukraine a couple years ago, the putsch, the coup d'etat that happened in Kiev, that was all the doings of Victoria Nuland. She's Assistant Secretary of State for Eurasia, and she's the person who oversaw the coup d'etat, and she installed the Prime Minister, Yatsenyuk, in Ukraine that caused almost a war with Russia, because Yatsenyuk was strongly anti-Russian, but about 25% of the population of Ukraine is Russian. So that didn't go too well. But these people, this PNAC Kagan family, they drafted a document 1 year before 9/11 in which they called for the United States to occupy Iraq and build permanent bases there, whether Saddam Hussein was on the throne or not. They said that didn't matter. We should do that as policy in the Middle East. And they said the process of transformation, this military transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. And this, of course, was the new Pearl Harbor. 9/11 was the terror atrocity that changed America, it changed American foreign policy, and it brought us the war on terror. But as I've tried to make clear now, the war on terror was already like a bonfire that was all built, ready to light, all gassed up, and the enemy was painted on the back wall. They just needed to light it. And this is the spark that lit it. And as I said, Ehud Barak said, now it's time, finally America, now it's time to launch an operational, concrete war against terror. He said that before either building fell, just to give you an indication of how early they did it. And this is something called the primacy effect. When something like this happens, the culprits want to get their narrative out there first, before you have time to even scratch your head and think, who might have done this? Before you even get to that point of thinking, they're telling you who did it. And you'll see it with every terrorism attack, every false flag terrorism attack that happens these days, you'll see they do exactly the same thing. And reading from the Zionist script on 9/11, President Bush said, our way of life and our very freedom was under attack. He said, America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world. Obviously, the terrorists didn't know about places like Switzerland, where there's plenty of freedom and opportunity. And a few days later, on September 20th, 2001, it was 9 days after 9/11, he declared war on terror, saying in Congress, every nation and every region now has a decision to make. Either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. He basically bifurcated the world into terrorists and U.S. allies. That scared a lot of countries. What I want to point out in this slide, you see the Speaker of the House behind him, who's shaking his hand, clapping his hands. That man is Denny Hastert, and if you're familiar, he's been proven now to be a pedophile who spent millions of dollars trying to keep the young men quiet back in Illinois who he had molested. And I would say that there are probably more men like him in Congress than you understand, than you think. But wait a minute, wait, just a second. What is the war on terror? And where did it come from? Where and when did Americans start behaving like this? You know, putting people in gulag archipelagos, you know, the kind of thing the Soviet Union had, torturing people, you know, depriving people of any due justice. Well, the war on terror is an Israeli stratagem pushed by Netanyahu since 1979 to bring the United States military into the Middle East to wage war on behalf of the Zionist state of Israel. And here's Mr. Netanyahu, after they had the conference in 1979 on international terrorism, where George Herbert Walker Bush spoke at the final session in July 1979. Then he cranked out a book with the speeches from that conference, and then he began pushing this doctrine called the War on Terror in books and articles and speeches. Here are two of the books that he wrote in the 1980s, Terrorism, How the West Can Win, and another one, Fighting Terrorism. And Netanyahu uses the word terrorist to delegitimize the Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation. This is the wall that the Israelis have built across the Holy Land, separating the Jewish population from the Palestinian population. And these are a couple of Palestinian terrorists fighting against the Israeli occupation of their homeland.